we've seen how we can output text to the console. We've also seen how to store values in variables. So now let's have a look at how we can take inputs from the user. Here we've got a very simple program where we are storing the value of Ben to the variable name, and we are simply printing hello with a space and joining name to it. Now there's actually another way of doing this. I'll just show you this now. Use a comma instead of a plus symbol. It actually inserts a space for you. So if we run this, we'll see we get the exact same output from both of these. Hello Ben. So this is kind of where we're going to be starting out with, and we're going to be changing the value of Ben to an input from the user. So we can accept input from this program by changing this string value to the keyword or function input with brackets at the end. And now if we run the program, we see it won't come to a complete stop straight away, but it won't tell us anything. So we're going to need to change that eventually. Now let's just put Ben into the terminal here, and we get the desired output, hello Ben. So from here, what we can do, we can put a string inside of the brackets of the input statement, and we can show something to the screen. So for example, enter your name, like this. And now if we run this again, we can see enter your name appears first, and that's when we are asked for the input that is then stored into name and then outputted to the console later on. So that was quite a simple task. What if we want to do something a bit different? Instead of enter your name, what if we want a number? And now the variable name doesn't make so much sense, so let's use F2 to rename it to num, for example. And now instead of hello num, let's say your number plus 1 equals, and just before that let's do num plus equals 1. So got our number that we're taking as an input, we are adding 1 to it, and then we are displaying it to the console. Now this should work, right? If we are asked to enter a number, we enter 15, we should get 16, but oh no, we get a type error. So problem here is with line 3, where we are trying to add 1 to num. Now this is a problem because num is a string and 1 is an integer. So we can't really combine these two types together, or we can't combine these types together at all. So what we're going to need to do, we are going to need to change the type of num to an integer so that we can add 1 to it before we can then play the result. In order to convert our variable num from a string, which is the default value for input, into an integer where we can add 1 to the value, we need to use the int function. Now we saw this briefly in the previous video, though we didn't really explore function usage. So what we can do is we can say num equals, we redefine num to be integer result of num. So int num will just convert the value of num into an integer. So if we were to run this and we enter 15, this should work, right? Well, not quite. We still have the error where we can only concatenate a string to another string. We cannot concatenate an int to a string. Now, what this means is we cannot use the plus operator to join a string to an integer. So we can solve this problem using a very similar thing. Use the string function, convert num back into a string, or we could even do that down here. But now, if we run the program, we get the correct answer. Now, just before we move on, instead of using num equals int num, we can actually just wrap the int function around the input like this, and we will get the same result. Now that we know how to convert between strings and integers, I thought I'd show you some of the others in this program here. I've actually used a comment trick here. I've got a multi-line comment to hide away all of this code from actually coming into effect and buttering up the output, so we can enable them one at a time. So if I just comment out this multi-line comment, we can see that all the code comes back active now. So what we can do here is we can convert a floating point value into an integer, and if we run the program, actually, let's see what the output of that is. We can see it's a 1. So when we convert a floating point number into an integer, we truncate it, or we just cut off the decimal value, and we just keep the integer part of it. If we want to be able to round up, so for example 1.4 would go to 1, but 1.6 would go to 2, we can use this round function here. Now this is mostly about the int, float, bool and string functions, but I thought I'd include round because it's relevant to converting from a float to an integer. Another common thing you might want to do is get what's called the ceiling of a number as opposed to the floor. So instead of truncating the number, ignoring the decimal point, you might want to always round up. So if you have 1.1, well, that's over 1, so we want to jump to 2. And we can do this just by using int, the float number plus 1. Okay, so moving on, we have the round as we sing. We use the int function with a Boolean value, true or false. We just get 1 or 0, 1 for true, 0 for false. And you can see here, this one isn't as useful. I don't know if I've ever actually used it, but here it is. I've just put a hash symbol or a comment next to all of the ones that I think are quite useful to know. So moving on, we have the int function with a string like we've seen before, and we just get the integer version. But what if we were to use that with a string that doesn't have an obvious number representation? So 50, the string, we can see is a number. But what if we tried to convert hello world into an integer? Well, if we uncomment this and run the program again, well, we can see we get an error. We get a value error because Python doesn't know either. So make sure whenever you're converting a string to an integer that you do have all number characters. So moving on, floats are rather similar. I just take this here and do this. You can see that we can convert an integer into a float. It will just add 0.0 to the end. We can convert a Boolean to a float, which is 1.0 or 0.0 instead of 1 and 0, like with the integers. We can convert a string with a decimal point into a floating point number. So before, we are only allowed numbers pretty much, whereas floats can allow 1 point for decimal, and it works. But we still have the value error if we try to convert a string without the right characters. So moving on, we've got 2 Boolean. So let's just run this. If we try to convert an integer into a Boolean, we can see that it is true if it is not 0. So any value that is not 0, if I change this to -10, will be true. Only 0 gives false. And a similar thing happens with floats, except it needs to be 0.0. And a very similar thing again happens with strings. It needs to be the empty string to give the false result, otherwise it will be true. Now these aren't very useful. You can see I haven't marked them with a comment. That's because of something called truthiness, which we will explore later on. A bit beyond where we are at the moment, but just know that these aren't too useful, but they are good to know. They are good to know. So moving on a bit more to string. We have seen this one before, where we convert an integer to a string. Works the same with a float number as well as a boolean. It just converts it to string, true or false, like that. Now that we have covered input, output, type conversion, variables, and arithmetic in Python, we can actually get started with an actual project. So what I want you to do is I want you to create a program that asks for 2 input values, a base and a height of a triangle, and I want you to calculate the area of a triangle, and then I want you to display the result to the screen. Now, if you want to have a go right now, pause the video now. I'll give you 2 hints, and then I will show you my solution. So the first hint is that the area of a triangle is the base times the height of the triangle divided by 2. So hopefully that can help some of you. And the second hint is I'm going to show you this area of a rectangle program that we saw at the start of episode 1, where we can see we get a width and a height. We calculate the area using width times height, the area of a rectangle, and then we output to the screen like this. Now I'm going to show you my version of the program just here. We've got a base equals an input, enter the base of the triangle, and we want to convert that to an integer. We've got the same for the height. We are then calculating the area, base times height divided by 2, and then we are printing the result. We just run a test here. We have a triangle with a base of 10 centimeters maybe, and a height of 5, then the area is 25. That's all for this video. Next video we will be covering if statements.